Yes, I can hear you.
This is my first time attending, so.
Same here.
Hello, all.
Hey, John. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Long time no see.
Yeah. All right. Let me ping in. See if we have anybody join any who RSVP'd. Noir should be here. Crobe should be here. Josh, you should be here. I don't know if anybody else is going to be joining us. So, oh, there's Matt. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
Give it a couple more minutes. Olga, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Oh, I haven't chatted with you in a while. It's been
a while.
Yeah. All right, let me ping Manoir and see if he's going to be joining us. Wrong Slack channel. I have too many Slack channels. This is ridiculous.
Hello.
No, I heard there's a saying that on the internet, nobody knows if you're a dog or not.
So hopefully that's not the case here.
I know, right? All right.
So just near dogs. Sorry.
Yes. Welcome. All right. So let me pull up the meeting notes and create an area for us to communicate. Today's date is the 15th. 15. So the meeting notes are linked in the invite. If you could ungray your name if you are here, that would be very helpful. I can also post the link into the Zoom chat. So I spoke to Brian Bellendorf about the calendar topic. And the current best practice for managing calendar invites from the OpenSSF is to copy or have the OpenSSF calendar, and then on all of the calendar invites, you can do a drop down, and then there's a copy button, and that will copy the calendar invite to your own calendar. And so that's the best way to manage invites, because the OpenSSF doesn't want the project the project leads to manage calendar invites. And there's no great way for people to opt into the calendar invites themselves via like an email group or something like that. So best practice, go to the working group calendar, select the calendar invite, and copy the reoccurring event onto your calendar if you would like to attend in the future. Perfect. So that's that out of the way. Let's do intros. There are some new faces here. So let's just go around and introduce ourselves. I'll start. My name is Jonathan Lightshoe. I am a senior software security researcher for the Linux Foundation under Project Alpha Omega, which is under Open Source Security Foundation. I am the work that I've been doing over the past several years is automating fixing vulnerabilities at scale across open source, using tools like Modern and bots that I've written to just bulk generate pull requests. And so I've been part of the vulnerability disclosures working group and decided to break this topic out into an independent discussion group to pull in people who wanted to engage in this topic and this work. So who wants to go next?
I guess I'll volunteer as tribute. Unless Olga, you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Hi everybody. I'm Josh Beaker. I'm a research analyst for Cloud Security Alliance, so nonprofit, and I help with the Global Security Database project. So yeah, trying to help out where I can.
I'm going to go next. I'm Olga Kunzic. I'm co-founder at Modern, the company behind Open Rewrite refactoring engine and recipes, working with a lot of vendors. We're working with Jonathan Lightshoe. Thank you, Jonathan, for your contributions with security recipes and around control flow and the data flow. Really enjoy working with you. Push the boundaries of so many things. I really enjoy working with you.
So I'm Yoram Perkul. I'm currently a director of vulnerability research at a startup, security startup based in Israel called Resilient. We do vulnerability management based on runtime analysis. So we prioritize vulnerability based on the fact that they have active code that's loaded to memory, and we do a bunch of other stuff. I'm also involved in several other OpenSSF working groups, as well as the CISA, mainly the VEX working group. When I find the time, I try to pop in to a few others around SBOM. That's basically it.
All right, I can't seem to get my video working. There's a browser error, but I'm Matt Smith. I'm working at Google right now. I'm in the Google Cloud section, but I'm really interested in the the overlay between open source and what cloud customers need. So essentially, that most of the dependencies are open source. So how do we how do we understand how to fix open source and bring it to the cloud customers? I have a bunch of colleagues that are more in the open source side, though. This is my second meeting I just joined, but thanks for the interest.
You're on mute, by the way.
Good. What was the last thing that was heard from me?
Nothing.
Oh, okay. All right. Great. Looking for someone to does anybody want to scribe for the meeting notes? All right, I'll take care of that. Opens. Are there any opens? Any open discussion points that people want to discuss before we dive into anything else? Or any questions, concerns, ideas? Perfect. Okay. So there is a specification that I will open up, or I'll send a link to this. This is a document that I am looking to send to, is that the same document? No, it's a different document. So this is the specification defining what is the proposed idea is defining an open source security foundation compliant automated vulnerability fix campaign. So it's at a high level, it's a document that states if you follow these sets of rules, you can throw the Open Source Security Foundation name on your campaign, and it will have hopefully it will mean that your campaign is following the best practices in that the Open Source Security Foundation is defined around this topic. So I've had it get reviewed from people from like Kate Catlin, who's the PM for GitHub's security, Xavier, who's the head of the GitHub Security Lab. I've run it by a couple other people. There's some open topics and open questions that exist within this document that we want to discuss. The first primary open question in this document is about under section 3, vulnerability messaging. There was a topic of whether or not we should support some sort of opt-out mechanism for this. So should we should automated pull request generation campaigns be required to support an opt-out mechanism? Xavier argues that yes. Brian put up a couple of possible answers. If we do support an opt-out, yes, but opting out doesn't mean PR not sent. It means PRs are public by default. So the diff will be public by default. And then the other option is yes, which means the project is skipped entirely. And then we publish that list. You can always publish that list of projects who have opted out on a public website or something like that. Does anybody here have any opinions on this topic?
I guess just chiming in as a dev, having an opt-out would definitely be mandatory in my opinion, because otherwise you're going to piss people off. So as far as what that looks like, probably just skipping the PRs or some other mechanism where they don't really have to deal with it. But at the same time, I don't know, because what do you do then if they have open vulnerabilities and there's no PR to fix it? Do you just disclose it and not have the PR be generated? Or I don't know if there's a good answer for that.
That's right?
Is there any progress on private PRs?
Yes, there is. GitHub is going to be publishing that API. Kate said in, let's see, features like GitHub private vulnerability disclosure currently does not have an API. She responded on March 9th that this will be coming out in 2 weeks, but Xavier responded, this would also require this feature to be opt-out instead of opt-in. So currently enabling private vulnerability disclosure is an opt-in functionality on a repository. It's not opt-out. So almost all repositories across GitHub don't have this feature enabled. Is everybody aware of what GitHub private disclosure is?
I could use a primer.
Okay. GitHub. So are you familiar with GitHub security advisories, GHSAs? Sorry, I can't hear you, Matt.
Sorry, yep, I can. Yeah,
okay. So GitHub security advisories, the way, so when you're disclosing a vulnerability, the current flow is you ask the maintainer, hey, can you open a GitHub security advisory? They say yes, they open the advisory, they invite you to it, you have the discussion there. The problem with that is that there's this lead time where you have to ask the maintainer to open a GHSA to let you report the vulnerability to them. And so the current model is like 2 stages, right? The goal of this new feature that GitHub announced back in November is, or this new feature they announced is the ability for security researchers to report security vulnerabilities to projects proactively. So there's under the security tab, you can select, I want to disclose a vulnerability, and that'll immediately create the private channel you can discuss things in. GitHub has not opened this up publicly it's an opt-in feature that you can enable on a repository. The reason that they make this opt-in is because they don't want to create maintainers already have enough spam coming into them that they don't want to create another channel where maintainers can get spammed when in a place that GitHub can't monitor, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it sounds like the regular flow is you have to ask each time to open up a private communication channel, and this would allow a maintainer to opt in so that they can skip that step in the future.
Correct. So researchers can report directly. Yes. There also the other problem is that GitHub security advisories, GHSAs, when you're interacting with them, they previously have not had an API. So there's been no public GitHub API for them. The only way to interact with them is by the UI. So if you're trying to do automated pull request generation and automated security fixing at scale, you can't privately disclose those vulnerabilities, right?
Right.
So GitHub is adding support for an API for opening GHSAs or opening private disclosure channels and also interacting with GHSAs via GitHub. So that is coming, hopefully within the next 2-3 weeks. So we should see that. The outstanding problem is if so maintainer opts out. The way that I have been handling opt out to this point is I will screen share. I've been doing this. So I have so in my campaigns that I've been running, I have this pull request message. So this is the pull request message. Opt out. If you'd like to opt out of future automated vulnerability security fixes, please consider adding a file called .github/ghrobots.txt to your repository with the following line. For many years, no repository did this. But more recently, some project like the Apache Software Foundation has done this, and the Jenkins team did this at the top level in their .github repository. I wasn't really necessarily considering that one, the Jenkins case, but the Apache Software Foundation in a couple of their Apache Commons libraries has done this. So this is the kind of standard that I was proposing that we if we were to do an opt-out mechanism, this would be the opt-out mechanism. Or there's another standard that's Luigi is working on a project that is like some JSON file you drop in your GitHub repository that defines a bunch of characteristics about it, like is this project alive? Is it dead? Do you accept contributions? Yada yada yada. And so this could be another optional field in that standard as well. I would need to talk to Luigi more, but so there's mechanisms that we could support for opt-out, but the question is, for an open source security foundation compliant automated vulnerability fix campaign, do we want to support opt-out? And Josh, you're arguing that yes, we should, because otherwise you're going to piss off maintainers.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a global opt-out, or is it an opt-out for a specific actor? Right? Is it I don't want anything, or do I only want? Is it
per actor makes sense to me? Because
granular?
Yeah. Like thinking about it from the perspective of like, hey, I have this Ruby library I'm maintaining. It could be that you find a particular actor is not up to the quality that you want, or maybe you tend to handle the patches for those directly rather than through whatever automation they have set up. Because otherwise, if it's just a blanket turn everything off, I don't know, that it would get the job done, but and I guess the other side of that is if you make it per project, then it's also, well, if they have like 20 different things they have to opt out of, that might also piss them off. So
granular, but also like there's the granularity, but also an option to disable for all.
Yeah, if that wouldn't be too much trouble, I think that would be nice from the maintainer perspective.
Okay. Where's my mouse?
Because, for example, when you originally asked this, I thought you were talking about like per like user account or per project. But for example, you might want to on one project turn everything off, but another one just turn one or two things off or keep them all on.
Right. Next. Okay, so this will be should be opt out. So I will add a section for opt out, defining what opt out means and how that works. Is there anybody else who has a counterpoint or counter argument to whether or not they should opt out or support for opting out?
It sounds like to me it would add legitimacy and be more like mailing lists versus spam. But I don't think I understand what would be the dynamics between if you wanted only certain campaigns or certain submitters to do it. Yeah, so I think exploring the granularity and like what do package maintainers want is interesting.
The counterpoint that I have to not supporting opt-out is these are the goal of any of these campaigns should be at worst a security hardening and at best fixing a valid security vulnerability, right? So given that these projects are not just about the maintainer's perspective, but about all of their downstream consumers, right? It's about the security of not just the project, but also the downstream consumers. Do we want, if the repository accepts contributions and hasn't been archived, do you want to support the ability for maintainers to drop? Josh, you got a hand up.
Yeah, my thought would be like at the end of the day, you're going to get a security vulnerability ID for it, and whether you care is kind of up to you. But that protects the end users because hey, this project has security vulnerabilities. They're choosing not to patch them, but you still give them the option of not having to be bothered by it.
So we could still get so context. Josh works for GSD still.
Yeah, so Cloud Security Alliance and then the GSD project is one of our open source initiatives.
So GSD is a database of vulnerabilities, and I've spoken to a couple of people. GSD is like CVE light, so it's an ID for a vulnerability, but it doesn't necessarily need to go through the vetting process that CVE requires. And so you're saying that we could theoretically assign a GSD to it, even though, right, you fix it, but you don't contribute it, and you publish it somewhere saying, hey, this fix is pending, but the maintainer rejected it.
Exactly.
And you still assign a GSD ID for it.
Yeah, and one of the things that would potentially make that more palatable too is we're adding types to the IDs. So you could say this is a security concern versus this is a like confirmed vulnerability. So
Okay. So should the would it be good to generate the diff and maybe have that sitting on a commit branch, but not have the pull request get generated? So you can have it get to the point where the diff has been generated, but not the pull request.
that makes sense to me. And what you could do is using the OSV schema, put that as like an evidence reference on the ID. So here's our demonstration of why this is a vulnerability.
Interesting. Okay. So still generate the diff, assign a GSD, don't link the GSD to the diff, don't generate the PR. Okay, so you're still disclosing the vulnerability in that way, but you're not. Okay, and so you can communicating that this is the flow, right? In the to the maintainer saying like, hey, if you opt out in the future, just a heads up, you're still, the vulnerability will still get published and still go public, but you're just not going to get harassed about it. Like if you want it to, if you want to know about it, great. If you don't,
Yeah, I think that's the best of both worlds, because then maintainer can say, hey, I don't want to deal with it, but you're still not just saying, hey, there's a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that are going untouched. So
okay. I
think it'd be nice to have a sorry, I was interrupting. I think it'd be nice to have, if there's a global opt-out, to have that data accessible. Because I know some folks are they're putting together sort of scorecards and other ways of evaluating open source repositories. So yeah, if they're not accepting these, maybe that'll factor into a signal. So having one global opt-out list that's accessible.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way that there's no, what do you mean in a global opt-out? Like requiring people to register to a single central location instead of having them put it in their GitHub repository?
I was thinking that if let's say, yeah, they might have it in their GitHub repository, but if I'm developing a tool and I'm going to use that automated tool to put a bunch of pull requests, that I'm going to have to go and look up the opt-out list at some point so that I'm not bothering those folks, because that's sort of like what I'm imagining is the coordination from different people trying to, like comply with this specification, is that they're going to have to look up that opt-out list. So just making that also, available not just to the folks making the tooling to submit the pull request, but also to others that are evaluating repos.
So that I think maybe ties in to another component, which is around security assertions. And so given that security assertions, which is a project that is also somewhat under Alpha Omega, is being built out as a platform to show this stuff, that could be a place where this information gets encoded. So it's not a requirement of this working group that information be centralized, but it could be something that the security assertions working group UI presents as one of those assertions that, hey, this project has opted out.
Yeah.
And so that would make that something that is encoded. I think that the encoding the information that the opt-out is present into the repository source code means that you can always be using the like if they decide to opt back in, they can just delete a file from the repository, right? So but you want that centralized location for that information. So security assertions, I think, could solve that problem. I will mention, yeah. Okay. I will put a note there. Are there any other, yes, you got a hand up, go for it.
Yeah, just another use case I see for the opt-out is for end of life, end of support versions. So you could have a vulnerability in a version of a package that is no longer supported, and the maintainer will tell you, okay, I'm not going to fix it. It's out of scope, and that's a use case where he'll probably opt out for those specific versions, but we still want people to know that if they're using these versions, that these vulnerabilities exist. They're not going to get fixed, and also the maintainer will probably want to get a constant PR requests. So that's a use case where I see the opt-out will be helpful.
So that's a branch sort of granularity then.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe branch, maybe tags, I don't know. But yeah, end of life versions is something that we should probably consider in that context.
Olga, in your experience working with customers or just in general, have you seen cases where your end users want changes contributed to multiple branches that represent multiple different versions of their application?
So the reason this popped to mind is there was this vulnerability recently where you had with OpenSSL, and Node had it built into their code, and then it was relevant from Node 16 through Node 17 and up to Node 18. And then when Node issued their security advisory, they said, folks that are using Node 17 and 18, please be advised, we have this vulnerable OpenSSL and an upgrade. And then I reached out to one of the core maintainers, and I told him, you have OpenSSL in Node 16 as well. And then his response was, yeah, but we no longer support it. So we expect user to update to 17 or 18. So they didn't even thought to mention it. But the vulnerability is still there. So, and it's not something that they're planning to fix because it's end of life.
Right, that makes sense. Olga, so what has your experience been around contributions to multiple maintained branches? Is that something that the customers have, or you've seen experience? I was picking that at Olga, not Yoda.
I think it's common that they still use like Git flow, the main branch for some other branch for the next release and so forth. So yes, it's a vulnerability. Fixing it across all of those would be important.
One thing to be, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Josh.
I guess one thing I was going to add to that really quick is one thing to be cautious of if you do start looking at branches is there might be branches that aren't tied to a major version. And if you start opening PRs against those, oh boy.
I think with open source, you could open it against the main and let them pull it to whatever branches they want.
Yeah, I think that makes the most amount of sense. So is that a rule that we want to encode in this policy, that the change should always be contributed against the default branch?
That seems reasonable to me. And then you can request having it be done for other branches, but by default, it's just the default branch.
Yeah.
But yes, when in customer environments, they do commit against various different branches, depending on what they want to do.
Right. Okay. Just got a message from Chrome. he's missing the meeting. It's all good. Okay.
And I think, sorry to bring this up again, but I think private PRs for security vulnerability disclosures are critical. I don't know how we can have GitHub enable those by default.
Yes.
I think that's the main pushback that you've been getting from maintainers, is that you announce the vulnerability before they can merge it and incorporate in all of their versions, etc.
Yeah. I need to, so Michael Scovetta is communicated with me that he's going to be sitting down with the GitHub folks about that shortly to discuss that feature and having it being enabled by default. Yeah. There's one, so under mandatory private disclosure, there's this other topic. So what I originally said was the top 10 vulnerable projects within the top 10,000 critical open source projects, as defined by the OpenSSF Security Critical Projects Working Group, must receive private disclosure reports manually if needed. Disclosures may follow a standard disclosure timeline, example 90-day disclosure timeline. So two problems with this line when I wrote it. First off, the top 10,000 critical OSS projects list is not an ordered list. It's an unordered list. And the second problem with it is that that list actually wasn't developed by the Open Source Security Foundation Critical Projects Working Group. It was developed by Alpha Omega. So one of the concerns that I have is if there is a list of top 10,000 projects and you've got a vulnerability that impacts the top, or impacts 100 of them, or 1,000 of them, you're expected to do private disclosure to all 1,000 of them in one of these campaigns. And that seems like an excessive, it doesn't seem necessarily excessive. It just seems, it's a difficult proposition to say you've got to go through manual disclosure on all of these projects. And so Brian Bellendorf's response to this is why only the top 10 shouldn't reports all be private at first. And my thought is, I don't know how to solve this problem, right? You want to privately disclose to the critical projects, but if they haven't enabled GitHub private disclosure, how do you do this in a way that's sane? There was a flow that was proposed by Yesenia and myself that is a corollary to this, where you automate the process of issuing an issue, requesting that the maintainer enable private disclosure, and then from there you, if the project doesn't opt in within 20 days or something like that, then you will automatically generate the pull request. But that's a bunch of additional automation that you then have to write to do that work and, that flow as well.
Is there potential to solve it sort of one time to say that if you want to be in these top 1,000 list and you want to be getting the private disclosures, that this is what you need to do?
So the top 10,000 is intended to be a list of top critical open source projects as defined by either the Open Source Security Foundation critical projects. There's a calculation that you can run against a repository to determine if it's in the critical, give it a criticality score. Then there's also the Harvard census that was done that determined what critical open source projects were. So there's a couple of lists out there that were kind of glommed together to become the critical 10,000 list. So it's not something that you opt into becoming a part of. It's something that kind of gets determined by data accrued over time. I mean, you can make a solid argument for why you should be a critical project, and you could probably get added that way.
Or maybe it's not about whether or not you're a critical project. It's just about if you want to receive the benefit of a private disclosure.
Well, the idea would be anybody who has private disclosures enabled can get them that way, right? You just have to enable it. But if you're not going to use GitHub's, like if you're going to say, yes, I want a private disclosure, but I'm not going to use GitHub's flow, that's the problem, right? Because then that takes it out, that takes the process out of band, right? It means that they're expecting a private disclosure via a different channel. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
I have maybe a dumb question. So what's the distinction with these critical projects for like wanting to do the private disclosure versus public? Is that just because the fallout from doing a public disclosure could be more significant?
Yes, that's the idea. Yes. So trying to minimize the downstream impact.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I mean, one alternative is to say when this feature get like when there's an API finally for GitHub security advisories, we can get to the point where we say, all right, you have like mandatory private disclosure, you must if the project that is vulnerable is in the top 10,000 list, you must request that the project enable GitHub private disclosures. If they do not, within 20 days, you may issue a public pull request.
Would it make sense to just have this policy across the board? So just always try to go for the private disclosure, or is that just a problem of?
It's a problem of scale.
Yeah.
Right.
Because if it becomes manual, then obviously everything kind of goes out the window.
Yeah, the other big issue that I've run into is there's a lot of projects that are unmaintained. And so someone coming across a project, it's more, I think that at a certain point, it's more important for somebody to come across an open source project and see the pull request. But I guess we're still putting that 20-day timeline on there, right? Like if you don't act on this issue within 20 days.
Yeah, because that would kind of have the same effect where, hey, they didn't respond for X amount of time. Now we're making it public. And if that's just the only PR people see when they go to the project, it's going to be pretty obvious that, hey, this thing isn't being touched.
So I would love to get here when GitHub supports it. But do we build this document around what GitHub doesn't support today, but will be? Or we theorize that they're supporting? Or do we build it around what GitHub is currently supporting and then modify it once there are more capabilities that we can work with?
Something else that comes to mind is what if projects are hosted on, say, a different platform that doesn't support this yet? So maybe the same thing would be having something defined where if the platform doesn't support automated private disclosures, you do one thing. And if it does, then you just use automated private disclosures.
Yes. Yes. All right, let's so the current state of the world is no platform supports this, right? No platform supports this. So given that no platform supports this, we're currently left with open pull requests, right? And the thing we're trying to avoid is private disclosure. The thing we're trying to avoid is the problem we're trying to solve is the scale of the problem, right? The scale of the problem is you've got 50, 60, 100, 1,000 projects all with the same vulnerability. At a certain point, you just have to open the pull request.
Is there a way to automate notification?
No, because every single project has a different disclosure channel, right? Some of them use HackerOne, some of them use security.txt, you know, some of them have a security email address, some of them use BugCrowd. Because the disclosure, because there's no standardized disclosure channel, doing this at scale is a problem.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky. I mean, dumb idea, and probably don't do this. What if it's something like creating automated issues to say, hey, we suspect we have a vulnerability for your project, please contact us?
This is exactly the problem we're trying to get away from, because it just overwhelms maintainers.
Yeah,
right?
It pisses them off.
Yeah, you're more likely to piss. I feel like that's more likely to piss them off than just giving them the change and saying, here, merge this, please.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm just trying to think of how we navigate this.
So with respect to, do we make the doc for what's available today versus what's available next? I think maybe I haven't, I missed parts of the, maybe it's written here somewhere in the doc, but it sounds like if the time it's going to take to, to review and ratify this document and then to get people to actually put it in practice is going to be longer than some things like that, you mentioned earlier, maybe 2 to 3 weeks for some things to become available, or APIs for the, like the, the GitHub, what was it called? The GitHub security advisory. And something like a timeline like that, I think it's reasonable to plan it out and have the discussion. Otherwise, maybe, have a section or proposed like, next version of this. So you could, we could have broken out a section of okay, like what's, what is going to be the, the next version of this doc with future facing features that we expect to be there. And then that can help shape what we're, a consolidated view of what the request would be to different, different repositories.
Yeah. So I think that yes, given the timeline that this document is getting processed, I think that if we see in 2 weeks what GitHub supports, that'll be really valuable. I mean, this working group doesn't meet until 2 weeks out anyway, so we will hopefully see what GitHub announces between now and then. Yeah, I think that. So there's 2 solutions to this problem. Either we order the 10,000, like either we get someone to order the top 10,000 open source projects list, and then we can say like, these are the top 10 or 20 some odd projects within this list, right? Like, or these are the 10, 20 critically impacted projects, or we remove this requirement and like make it a general rule of you have to use GHSAs whenever that's supported. But then how do you do this on platforms that are not GitHub, right?
Yeah, for example, I imagine there's going to be quite a few on GitLab. And what do we do if they don't support it?
Not a ton on GitLab, but yes.
I think it will be tricky to enforce. Also, the list will probably, as you mentioned before, it's probably dynamic in a sense. So the 10th critical of today won't be the 10th critical of tomorrow or next week or next year.
I know the other thing,
just to keep track.
The other thing that I was thinking about is, let's say you run the campaign and you get, you report it to the top 10 privately and they fix it. Now the top 10 is shifted to cover a different top 10 because one of them in that list fixed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like trying to distinguish between the top projects and the not top projects is making it more general might be and we can also
Yeah.
just put a pin in this for 2 weeks and see if this just
See if
happens.
it's resolved itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and nail down the other stuff in the meantime.
Yeah. There was another thing that Brian wanted in this document. He said so for vulnerability messaging, a campaign must include information like the impact of the vulnerability being fixed, a description of the code change with the fixed vulnerability identified, a public page describing the campaign and its compliance with this policy, and a contact information, example, email, Slack, for real humans who can follow up on the PR. I was thinking that so he wants to add that as a requirement. I was thinking if we leave that requirement in there, that's fine, but something that can satisfy that constraint is just an issue that like all these pull requests, like that can be a website or a page.
Or a template for the issues that are open, that contain this information.
Well, so what I've done previously is if you go to my issues, I just have like bulk PR tracking. So these are the tracking issues. And literally every time you open these tracking links, every single pull request is linked back to this issue. So you can see all the pull requests that were generated from this. And so that information could satisfy this policy, right? You can just use a GitHub issue with that. Does that make sense? Is that like a, yes, we can do that?
Question. So having the contact information makes a lot of sense. The page for the campaign, I'm trying to understand the distinction between that and just the description that's already in the PR.
That's a great question. I think that it's going to end up being duplicated information, honestly. Yeah, let me message. Yeah.
Because if the intent is understanding, hey, why does the campaign exist? It needs to exist somewhere, but if it exists on the PR, that kind of solves the problem. So.
Yeah. Ooh. All right, that's one of those questions.
Maybe ask like what is this public page supposed to serve? Like why?
So Brian's argument is that it should be an initial PR message so that people see it immediately. I'd argue. Why wait until wait, that was the point of the public page is to describe the campaign and give reference authority. Yeah, so it's to give reference authority. Like this is the source of this thing, right? This is the, like, without being a I don't know. I'm going to talk to Brian about that and ask him to give further feedback on this issue. Xavier wanted to add this requirement that there was a statement that the pull request had been reviewed by a third party. The topic being like, he said, so this be a can, not a must. The idea being that like the pull request has had some third party externally say like, yes, this looks like a valid security fix. So it can't be within your organization. So let's say you've got Trellix issuing the pull request. You've got to ask some other third party organization to vet your change.
Doesn't that kind of adds complication to the process and slows down? Like how would that work?
So in the past, I have asked the GitHub Security Lab to review the change that I'm going to be making. So like I tell them like, hey, this is what the change is going. This is what the change will be that I'm making. Does this make sense? So his point is that so it says, I think that adding this info in the PR, if this third party is willing to add its name to the campaign, which might always be the case, adds more weight and decreases the suspicion of bad intention.
So the idea is, in terms of the flow, that this kind of peer review will happen before the actual automatic PR is created, and then in the PR it will be listed. For example, this was reviewed by.
Yes,
X.
not necessarily the pull, not necessarily every single pull request, but the some examples, right? Unit tests or something like that that demonstrate the change, right? Were reviewed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know if I'd put it as a must.
Right.
Maybe as a desired.
Yes. Adding this info in the PR.
It might be worth distinguishing between the pull request being reviewed and the code that automates the pull request being reviewed. Maybe you could distinguish that as this campaign has been reviewed by a third party.
Yes. Wait, sorry, differentiating between
the direct pull request per project versus the campaign as a whole. Because I assume like GitHub Security Lab is not going to review each and every one of your PRs, for example, but they do review the code that generates it.
Yes. So let's do this, and then let's do a can. Can communicate the following. A statement is a pull request. Code change. This review may be this the commit message. How's that?
I guess my 2 cents would be being pretty explicit about it being the campaign and not the PR. Because I assume the intent is, hey, this isn't spam. Here is this third party that took a look at the campaign that we're doing and agreed that this is legit.
Yes.
Especially because one pain point that you could run into if you say, hey, this PR was reviewed by the third party is then, well, what if the PR happens to be one of the edge cases that you missed with your unit tests? And they like freak out over the code change being either incorrect or applying to the wrong section of code.
Yes. Yes. Does this need to be changed in any way to describe that better, or?
I think what you have right now is good.
We're at time, but one final thing I want to cover is I agree with Xavier's point here. An automated vulnerability fix campaign must not be used to advertise a company or product or service. Does that make sense?
1000%.
Yeah.
I would add the caveat that while it can't be used to advertise a company or product or service, it can be sponsored by. Right? It can't be used to advertise, but it couldn't be. The campaign can communicate that it's being sponsored by so and so, by an organization.
What's the difference?
Yeah, because I could see sponsored being viewed as just being advertisement.
So if you're using the campaign, the pull request body to like outwardly describe the features of this thing and why you should buy it or something like that, right? Like this. So this is an example of the source opting out. Sponsorship and support. This is what I've put previously in campaigns like this. This contribution was sponsored by Human Security and the New Dan Kaminsky Fellowship, a fellowship created to celebrate Dan's memory and legacy by funding open source work that makes the world a better and more secure place. This PR was generated by Modern's free for open source SaaS offering that uses format preserving AST transformations to fix bugs, standardize code, and apply best practices, migrate library versions, and fix common vulnerabilities at scale. So it's not really. Is that an advertisement?
Speaking personally, I would be fine with it, but I could also see why this would be a super touchy and gray area for a lot of folks. Because the question becomes, where do you draw this line of, hey, this is just who is sponsoring this project, who's helping make it actually run, versus, hey, by the way, check out this other stuff we do, which would kind of tip into the red zone, I'd say.
And
probably a good one to open up to a wider group for discussion.
Yeah, I will say, so I added it to the spec. All right, I will work on this document more and try to review some more feedback. I do want to close it out. We are 5 minutes over. Anybody, thank you for coming. I hope I'll see you all in 2 weeks. It'd be lovely to see you all again. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more attendance too. I know some people that meant to make it but couldn't. Yeah, feel free to continue to look over this document, read it through, and add comments and suggestions throughout it. You know, the more we can move this document forward, the best. Yeah. So thank you all. Any other questions or concerns or final points?
All good on my end. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. All right. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Thanks. Bye.
So,
Bye.
bye. Yeah.